And I think about the Lord, and I think about the Apostle Paul, and I think about the church in Thessalonica. And I think about many of you who are brand new in the faith, and we have a lot of people that have come to Christ in the last number of months. And from God's perspective, this is the care that needs to be demonstrated for the church and for people that have come to Christ. Paul was a man who described himself in chapter 2 as like a mother. In fact, he goes even farther. He calls himself a wet nurse. That's not the kind of thing that most guys want to refer to themselves as, like, I'm a wet nurse, you know? Well, that's wonderful. He calls himself a father, but he says, I have this heart like a mother, the nurturing aspect. I've got the heart of a father, the training, development aspect. And I care so deeply for you. He says, his heart pours out to this church. He loves this church, but he's separated from this church. But Paul says that he can't simply, from a distance, do nothing, knowing that this church needs good spiritual parenting. And so we find out in verse 1 that he says, when I could stand it no longer, I stayed in Athens and I sent Timothy to find out about your faith. You know, Paul had developed Timothy as a disciple. Paul had actually won Timothy to Christ. There was a time when, from a spiritual standpoint, Timothy was the child and Paul's hands were there with the undergirding hands of God beneath Paul. And Paul was discipling and mentoring young Timothy. Now, Timothy had grown to a place in maturity where he was actually able to be sent out on a mission himself to now nurture this young flock in Thessalonica. You know, that's one of the greatest needs in the church today, I believe, are men and women who are like Timothy, who've grown up in their faith and have a heart to hold in their hands, in their spiritual hands, the development and the life of another new believer that they've either led to Christ themselves or have come to their attention, and they need that kind of help. But I find that there aren't that many people that have that kind of a heart. I think there are three things that prevent that. And having said that, I want to also encourage you, because we have a lot of people in our church that are doing this. There are so many people in our church. In fact, when we went up to camp, Becky and I, every year, we want to teach people how to have a quiet time. And so that's kind of a normal thing that we do. So we had some 100 people up there, and we asked, you know, on the night before we were going to do the training, how many of you would like to be trained in the 9:59 quiet time and have never had that? And not one hand went up, because everyone had been trained on how to have a quiet time. I mean, that's an awesome thing. That's a result of your ministry. That's what God is doing through your life. You are like that, Timothy. You are like that heart of God that's been passed on, and what's been passed on to you, you are passing on to other people. But not everyone lives that kind of a life. Not everyone is ready on a moment's notice, like Timothy was, for Paul to say, Timothy, I want you to go to Thessalonica. I'm concerned about my children. But Timothy was ready. But not everyone is. And I was thinking, what prevents a person from being able to not only conceive a spiritual life, but to take care of that life after that newborn Christian comes into existence? And I think there are three things. I think one thing that prevents a person from caring from a spiritual newborn is spiritual immaturity themselves, not being mature, not growing up on the faith. The book of Hebrews chapter 5 talks about this, where the writer says that at the time that you guys should be teaching, you're still needing milk yourself. And he says you should be growing up in your faith. And so sometimes spiritual immaturity prevents a person from being spiritually reproductive. Another problem that's mentioned in Hebrews 12 and 2 Timothy chapter 2 is the entanglements in this life. I have some wonderful family. Not all of them have chosen to either be married or to have children. In fact, I've got 3 family members, either sister-in-laws or my own sister, who have chosen for whatever reason not to have children. And the thing about that is that everyone has a right to either have children or not have children. Becky's sisters are very accomplished attorneys. They're bright. They are kind of shaking the world. They're doing a lot. But I look at their life, and they've made a very strategic decision not to have children because they can't, and have made that not a priority of their life, which is fine. But when you have a lot of things in your plate, it makes it difficult. You have to kind of make choices. Like we were talking about the big rocks a few weeks ago in the jar. And you have to make a choice to make certain things a priority. Now, if you don't have biological children, that's totally fine. But spiritually, every Christian should be reproducing in their life with God. So there's a spiritual principle here that either immaturity spiritually or the entanglements of the world that prevent us, that say, I don't have time to meet with somebody. I'm not really, I want to evangelize. I want to share my faith, but man, that's a big commitment. I'm so busy. My house needs attention, and my yard, it's not as nice as my neighbor's yet. And, I've got a vacation I want to go on. I'm working extra hours. And so we have all these things that kind of derail us from actually making disciples. And so it's immaturity. The second is entanglements in the affairs of life. And then the third thing is where I come in, and the church and the leadership, is that we have a responsibility to train and equip people for the work of ministry. And that's found in Ephesians 4:12. So I've got a job. Our church has a job. The leaders in the church have a job to train and equip people how to actually make disciples. So there are three things that really prevent a person from being reproductive: immaturity, entanglement, and a lack of training. But Paul had made sure that none of those things were the case with Timothy. And Timothy was so responsive and eager, and he caught the vision, and he got it, and he understood that life wasn't about just kind of getting along and being happy and being pleasured, but it was about advancing the kingdom of God. And he shared Paul's heart, refused to be entangled, got the training he needed, and he grew spiritually so that when he was sent out, he was actually qualified to do the work.